Assalamu alaikum. My name is Malik. I'm Tunisian from Sfax, Tunisia to be particular. I'm 19 years old. I study mechanical engineering in the University of Kansas in the US. And yeah, Mariam invited me and I'm really excited.
During Bin Ali's reign, were you always against him, or did you ever hear arguments that were in favor of him, that supported him? And did you have moments of sympathy at times? What was your kind of thinking?
So to begin, I just want to the disclaimer that when I was 11 years old when the revolution started. So my memory of Ben Ali has always been of me being a child, but it's interesting to see it from that perspective. I lived my first 10 years of my life in Tunis when in the Ben Ali regime, and 6 months after we moved out, the revolution actually started. When we moved to the US 6 months after that, the revolution happened. But I remember like accepting it as a life, we always recognized that Ben Ali was a dictator, but it was something unspoken about, and it was something, especially specifically for us kids. It was any time that criticism came up or any jokes that were made about the government or anything like that, we were told by parents and we were told by teachers in the school and everything to not say that again or to not do that again. So from that point of view, I never got the privilege to see to think about criticism towards the regime until the revolution happened. And once the revolution happened, then the criticism, for me being more mature, and the criticism began to come in more widely.
Okay, I see. So, this is interesting because I felt a similar way in Morocco growing up as a child, because I was about the same age as you said you were in Tunisia, about 11 years old, when Hassan Thani was the king of Morocco. And he was more authoritarian than his son, who I understand that now Morocco's like a semi-democracy, it's still transitioning. So was it similar for you? Was it kind of like a realization as you became older that the system was a bit like that?
Definitely. Like when I thinking about it right now, it's almost as if like when we were kids, sometimes even making jokes about like religion and everything, your parents were like, that's like, they give you that look of, hey, don't make that joke because that's uncalled for, or something like you shouldn't go there, don't take it too far. And then whenever I particularly remember like a joke when I was in second grade, we would make a joke about how Ben Ali would go like this every time. And I went back home and I was like screaming it in our garden, in our backyard. And my parents were like, don't ever do that. And they gave me the look. And I was like, okay, that's a joke that's never going to be said again. And then, like you said, thinking about it again now and looking back, that was authoritarian a lot. That was very authoritarian. And that was, and at that time, Ben Ali was at his peak of dictatorship. So I can understand what my parents' worries of, we're not going to have our kid make a joke just because, and therefore we get in trouble or any of that. So I understand that where their worries are coming from, but it's certainly interesting to think about it in hindsight.
Sure. And just before I bring Sosan and Miriam into the discussion, I just wanted to ask, I thought that was quite interesting that you couldn't make certain jokes about religion. Obviously, I'm a Muslim, but I believe in free dialogue and open discussion about Islam and about politics. And I think it's in our tradition as North Africans to have that discussion. A lot of our great Islamic philosophers were North African, like Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Rushd, people like this, Ibn Battuta, and they encouraged open discussion. So I don't see how it's contradictory to our tradition to discuss these topics openly. But I always had the impression as a Moroccan that Tunisia was more secular than Morocco. So because obviously the French obviously colonized the entire of the Islamic Maghreb, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, but Tunisia always seemed to place a bigger emphasis on its separation of Sharia law and the secular state. So can you tell me more about like this? Do you feel that religion was still embedded in the political culture in Tunisia, despite that?
I can speak from a cultural point of view of that Tunisian culture tends to be either very Muslim oriented or very almost quote unquote anti-Muslim oriented, which is that fear of being very like actually like the fear of being extremists, so therefore being extra secular. But you, to a certain extent, you never that perfect middle ground is very hard to see in Tunisian culture, in my opinion. But yeah, that's the only thing I'm going to speak on that.
Sure, that's exactly what I was looking for. More kind of experiential comments. Miriam, are you in the chat? Are you able to talk?
Yeah.
So
can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So what was your experience? Did you grow up in Tunisia or outside Tunisia?
Honestly, unlike Malik, I've actually never lived to Tunisia. All I know about Tunisia is when I actually go back during the summer. My parents grew up there, but I actually never lived a day there. So I actually never had to experience like being told by my teachers to never speak about a certain matter or anything. All I knew about speaking of Ben Ali was that my parents under our roof would just speak of how much they opposed his regime, but that would never go out of our house. They'd never speak about it even to their closest relatives. It's always been like something we speak about amongst the four of us, but never a topic we spoke about with anyone else, to be fair.
Did you recognize?
I was quite young when the revolution happened as well. I was like 12 or something, 12, 13.
Yeah.
So most of the things I actually learned about Ben Ali were after the revolution happened. It was more about what my parents told me at the time, and what I learned more about was what I read about after like the revolution happened. Everything was kind of settled at that point.
Sure. Okay. Sure. And did you recognize? Because you were quite young, like you said, you were still kind of like an adolescent at the time. Did you recognize that the regime was problematic, or did you not have an opinion? Were you too young to have an opinion at the time?
I think at that time I was more influenced by what my parents were saying about him. That's all I kind of heard about Ben Ali. It's discussing Ben Ali was never something that was openly happening in Tunisia amongst family members. So really all I ever knew about Ben Ali was what my parents would say. So I kind of had that idea about him, but like my own perspective formed more after the revolution actually took place, when I actually was old enough to actually read more about it and have my own opinion, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And what is your view now that you're older? Like, how do you see the whole thing? Are you, obviously, most of us in this chat are quite supportive of the regime change, but do you have any reservations or doubts at the same time, or are you totally confident about the situation right now?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Just looking at it from his what he's done to the people of Tunisia and his crimes against the people is more than enough for me to just think what happened was correct. Okay. The only thing that bothers me till this day is the fact that justice was actually not served.
Justice is not served.
Justice was not served.
Yeah.
100%.
In what sense?
Justice was not served.
In what sense are you talking about? Certain political prisoners that were kind of imprisoned?
Prisoners, even the fact that he left without giving back the stolen money that his family took, without being held accountable for the crimes he committed and the violations he committed against the people of Tunisia, people living through trauma till this day because of his actions.
Yeah.
It's just sad. Not like it would matter, but not even an apology.
Yeah.
Not that it would change anything, but the least he could have done, he didn't do.
Sure. I'm going to throw a very difficult philosophical question now. So,
oh God.
So essentially, it may be that Tunisia was able to move on from him so easily because he did literally just leave, and he, well, obviously he didn't leave until the uprisings happened, but when substantial pressure emerged, he did flee the country, went into exile. Perhaps the fact that he wasn't held completely accountable, I'm just playing devil's advocate, perhaps the fact that he wasn't held completely accountable was what allowed him to go into exile and for Tunisia to move on.
Okay.
Whereas if there was the threat of international courts and international institutions, such as in the case of Bashar al-Assad, he may have been more stubborn in his conviction to stay, to escape that. So how do you feel about that? Do you think that's a compromise you're willing to take, or what's your view on that?
Yeah, give me a minute to actually
Fine.
form my opinion on this one.
Does anyone else have an answer? Sosan, for example, do you have an opinion on this? Are you Tunisian yourself?
Yeah, I'm half Tunisian, half Italian. I was brought up in Italy, born and raised.
Ziriab is, so we were discussing so essentially we're talking about Ben Ali in Tunisia, and one of the participants felt like she kind of felt frustrated by the fact that obviously he left the country, he died he died eventually in 2019, but she believes that he wasn't held to proper judicial process to see what was done wrong and to get justice for the situation. My question to her was, if him not being held totally accountable and being allowed to flee was what allowed Tunisia to move on, is that a compromise that she was willing to take? And a lot of us in this chat, including me, are struggling with that question. What do you have any opinion on that?
Interesting. Well, I would just ask why it is that he was able to get away. I think when we're talking about Tunisia, we have to think about who placed or who was acquiescent to Ben Ali staying in power for over 22 years and then turned on him. So it wouldn't, far be it from me to kind of pass comment on what Tunisians should kind of feel about a compromise being struck. But I would assume that if the price to pay for a new Tunisia is the removal and the kind of the passing or the death of the ex-president in exile, I think that's a small price to pay. But of course, that isn't the price to pay. Hopefully, as the conversation develops, we can start to talk about what has been the price of the revolution, of the Jasmine Revolution.
And Malik, do you have an opinion?
To a certain extent, yes. I think that the outcome that we saw, the consequence that came from the Syrian revolution, would not happen in Tunisian societies. For cultural differences, to be honest. That for number one. Number two, I think him leaving was a good thing, because it let the people, the Tunisian people show them that they have made some progress and to encourage them to go forward. So
I actually don't think him leaving was a good thing. I have to disagree with you on that one. I don't think him leaving was a good thing.
That's interesting.
No, I wish he didn't leave.
Okay.
Do you think that the revolution?
Because he was convicted.
Uh-huh.
Probably, considering the fact that I think the main reason that the Tunisian revolution succeeded wasn't the fact that he actually left. It's the fact that the Tunisian military actually stood with the people and with the revolution and with the transition to democracy. They supported the Tunisian people with that. So I feel like the Tunisian military played a huge role in the outcome of this revolution. Because when you look at other revolutions, most of the militaries actually stood with the leaders instead of that, with the people, against the people and with the leaders. I think the main thing that helped our revolution succeed was the fact that our military actually stood with us and not against us. Not the fact that he left.
Really
I wish he'd stayed and would have been convicted in Tunisia, alongside the people who actually worked with him, which some of them are still freely out in the country.
Yeah, exactly.
Which
freely
is the
out of the
main
country and
right
still
now,
in the
fact
government.
that we're still suffering from the same old regime mentality, and a large proportion of people still look back at Ben Ali and think we were better. It's the mentality that's still stuck with the people. That's the only thing hindering our revolution process, in my opinion.
And that point that you brought up, Mariam brought up about the people with him. Like, for me, I get so frustrated when I see people that are still in parliament, that are still in the Tunisian government right now, who were part of his government, that contributed to his tyranny, that contributed to the slaughtering of Tunisian people, and that are still being voted in, that are still being appointed by government officials to this day. So that's where my frustration comes in. I'm like, Ben Ali was the leader of that government, but he was not a leader, and a tyrant is only there by the people that enable him. So because of that, the people that enabled him were still there. The people that gave him that power are still to this day still active in that government, and that's what bothers me, and that's what frustrates me so much.
Are you talking about the Hizb al-Istiqlal?
No, Hizb Destouri. I'll just mention them, honestly. I'm sorry, but those people, that's the thing. These were the branches that were actually with Ben Ali. They were part of like Ben Ali's political party at the time. And now they're exactly the same. The only difference is they're elected democratically. And the fact that people are electing them there's no logical reason behind it except the fact that these people who elected them actually think that Ben Ali was a good leader. Why else would you elect people who worked under Ben Ali's regime? There's no other logical explanation to it, at least in my opinion.
So I'm gonna come back. I'm sorry for talking so much, but that's Mariam. It's a good point because I have cousins in Tunis who vote for these people, and the arguments, very heated arguments, have broken out in family functions because of this. And it's always come down to, well, I used to be able to put food on the table for my kids when in Ben Ali, in like the time of Ben Ali, but now I can't, and I'm blaming that on the revolution. While that's a very absurd claim to make, it's still, I understand where their frustrations are coming from, but their votes are being put into, from what the point that I see it is, they're putting their votes towards dictatorship.
I don't understand where their idea is coming from. It makes no sense. The thing is, people have this idea that we were so much better off, the economy was in perfect shape, when that's not really the case. Unemployment rates were high at the time, corruption was high, there was a lot of unfulfilled demand for social justice, there was so much. He set the foundation for a failure in the Tunisian economy, and the things we're suffering and going through right now are as a result of his regime. These are the long-term effects of his ruling. We would have reached the stage even if he was still president at this time. It's not the fact that because he ran away and because he fled, we're in this position. No, we're in this position because of him.
There was a looming recession coming up because of him. Whether he said or not, we were going to have that recession, but people can't be convinced of that, and therefore associate the recession.
They're trying to hide it by the economic figures, which are actually horrible, considering the fact that we have so much more potential and we had so much more potential to actually do better. But the fact that there was so much corruption at his time, we're in this stage because of him. That's the thing that people just can't grasp, and it's annoying. It's actually annoying because he wrecked the economy.
Yeah, if I may jump in here, I just wanted to say that I think I don't know if it's already been said, but what must be borne in mind is, of course, Ben Ali is he was supported. The Ben Ali regime was supported by the US, by Israel, by France, and by Italy, and it was Tunisia, and the Ben Ali regime was seen by Washington as a strategic partner. It kind of played a security role more than an economic role in the region, insofar as and that's the other point. When you mentioned about the army was debilitated by Ben Ali. Arguably, Ben Ali stripped the military from of its real power, and except for a very well equipped Tunisian special forces, which trained with the US military and took part in regional anti-terrorism kind of operations. But I think the connection, there seems to be some type of collective amnesia. This is the point I want to make. There seems to be collective amnesia insofar as the buck stopping with Ben Ali. I don't think the buck stops with Ben Ali. The buck stops with those who enabled him. So whilst you have, and I look forward to the conversation where you kind of explore the people around Ben Ali, the kind of kleptocracy that was in place. But of course, they were enabled by major powers in the world, and I would like to have some input from you guys of what you guys think about that.
Sure. So, are you talking? Is your question directed towards the state of collective amnesia specifically?
Yes.
Okay. Just before I answer, can you elaborate more on what you mean by the state of collective amnesia?
Okay, so I mean, without getting into a history lesson, the fact that Habib Bourguiba was deposed in a coup d'état by Ben Ali. Ben Ali was supported by the US. He was supported by major international players, and it's my view that the man Ben Ali, who had no son, he had no heir, there was no heir apparent. It's my view that the kind of major world powers who facilitated his rise and kind of kept him in power for 20 odd years were kind of struggling. We're thinking about what happens next, rather than allow a real popular revolution to take place. It's better to control that revolution, because, as I say, on the ground, what you had was the kind of marginalized. You had the lowest, the kind of lower classes, or however you want to term it, the kind of the working class and the middle class coming out into the street. But of course, if that happens and that continues to kind of grow, and it's an organic revolution, then you would expect the old guard, the people who were around Ben Ali, to have been removed. It's my view. This is my view that the major powers saw fit to kind of control the revolution, and I think that may be some explanation as to why you still have Ben Ali remnants of the Ben Ali regime still in power today.
I see. Okay, so I generally speaking, I agree with you in the sense that, even though, as you know, because you know my views on this Syria, that I'm generally in favor of democratization processes in North Africa and the Middle East, right? I agree with you that it's better to have those processes without mass turbulence and revolution. So in the case of, for example, when we were discussing Libya last time, I mentioned that I believe that it should have gone through Saif al-Islam, and then it should have gone to the popular vote. Now, in the case of Tunisia, I feel that relatively speaking, it's actually quite stable in its transition to democracy. The revolution didn't spark a civil. Well, I know that the benchmark, we're using quite a low standard, which is civil war. If we're going to talk about instability, it's quite a low standard to hold. But it hasn't fallen into the trap of Syria or Yemen. Even if we take a higher standard, for example, Egypt's case, where a civil war didn't happen, but it still caused mass instability, high unemployment, and basically a reversal to the previous system. So essentially, a lot of people feel like it was a complete waste of time. I feel like Tunisia's revolution was generally quite peaceful and stable. Do you have an opinion about this? Do you think that I'm underestimating its instability?
No, I think what I was getting at earlier was the fact that the General Union of Tunisian Workers, the UGTC, and the lawyers groups all joined demonstrations. I think this was the spontaneity of the revolution, the fact that you had real popular mobilization and like the working class and the middle classes gathered and started not only to question, not only to mobilize against social injustice, but to question the political power system itself. And you kind of saw early on in 2011 or 2010, I should say, late 2010, Ben Ali was completely unaware of what was actually happening, even despite the fact that he visited Wadi in hospital. His speech kind of indicated his obliviousness to what was actually occurring. As I say, he treated the protesters as extremists and paid agitators. He was completely disconnected from reality, and I think that's just reflective of the bubble that was created around Ben Ali. As I say, it was a kleptocracy. Ben Ali and the people around him took 50% of industry, and they were just taken off the top. Do you know what I mean? It was a very, very difficult situation that Tunisia was in. So I think that early popular mobilization and the fact that these groups were questioning the political power system itself was very troubling to international players who had a vested interest in the Ben Ali regime. Those players that I mentioned earlier, the US, Israel, and France and Italy, for example.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I see what you mean. So I think one of my gripes with Bin Ali, one of my major gripes, which hasn't really been touched upon yet, is his colonial links and his sympathy with kind of the French institutions in Tunisia. I think that was probably one of the reasons that I supported him being ousted. In terms of the bubble him being surrounded by a bubble, I completely agree with you, especially when he was hospitalized and when he was in exile. I had that impression as well. Now, the question, I wanted to touch up on something Malik said, which is that he's frustrated with his story, right, in Tunisia, because they still have parties that are contributing to their political process, even though they shared a platform with Bin Ali. But the problem with this is where I'm going to start disagreeing with you, Malik. So we're going to stop being friends now. The problem I have with this is that in many countries, we have political parties that share a problematic platform with an ex-leader. So, for example, if we take the Labour Party in the UK, with Jeremy Corbyn and Tony Blair, completely different characters, and it would be difficult to get somebody to stop being a Labour member simply because Tony Blair used to be in the party. So yeah, I don't know if yourself or Sean want to come back to that point.
That's a good point, but the difference between the UK, the United States, and many other countries that have well-established parties that have lasted for decades, if not centuries, is that Tunisia has parties that run for a year or two, 3 years, one election cycle, 2 election cycles, and then just disappears. We have a few well-established parties, but other than that, we don't have many well-established parties. So there is a reason why these parties come up, are well established, and then once they lose power, they go, and the same people go and make a new party. We saw that for the party, Al-Ittihad, there you go, Al-Ittihad, which was the main political party for Ben Ali. And then after he left, when almost the same people that were in that party transitioned into I'm blanking out with the political party names, but the party of the Sipsi, like some of those same people that were in Nida, thank you, Nida Tunis. Yeah. The same people that were in Al-Ittihad transitioned into Nida Tunis and just changed the party name. So it's the same people that with a different party name. So it's not the same as the UK, where it's the same party but different people. Sure. And difference, it's the same people with a different party name.
What you're saying is that you have a specific problem in Tunisia because those people from the party you disagreed with infiltrated another party. Is that what you're trying?
They didn't particularly infiltrate. They just created their own party so they can just change their labels. It's the same.
I'll give you an example. If you look at Nida, which was the party that got the majority under Sipsi's ruling in 2014. Okay. After Sipsi died, the party pretty much died with him. Let's be honest. Like they got 90-something seats, 80-something seats at the beginning. Now they got like 4 seats this election. Most of the people who were actually in Nida now went into another political party that was formed called Tunis. Some went into Tahya Tunis. These are new political parties that were formed with the new 2019 elections. So when you look at it, these people went from 2014 into being into one of the biggest parties into now being into another party. They just keep shifting from one party to another, but they all root back to Ben Ali's regime, if that makes sense. And these people openly speak about corruption and being against corruption when they were pretty much drowning in corruption under his regime and working under him. Does that even make sense?
Go on, Sean. I can see you're gagging to respond.
No, just assalamu alaikum, everyone. Sorry I was a bit late, but the browser on my computer wasn't really working. I was trying to load the chat. And I also saw your message, Miriam. I replied, so heads up, on Twitter. That's all right, no worries. It was absolutely fine. I just wanted to make sure I replied to that before I joined this chat as well. Oz, what was your question earlier? I kind of got the tail end of that. You were making some sort of point about political parties.
My question earlier, now I need to revise it because the example that Malik provided has changed the parameters of the question. So if we look at, again, UK, and we see Labour members leaving the party and creating Change UK, right? So, for example, what was he called? Chuka Amuna and the other Labour members, because of their complaint about anti-Semitism. Similar, well, obviously it's a completely different case, but in Tunisia's case, problematic people were leaving parties, creating a new party, and essentially the Malik feels like they're infecting the political process in Tunisia. Now,
can I ask people what, because I want to get, because I was totally honest with her, he kind of brings me in here. Sometimes I know about a topic, sometimes he brings me in as that kind of outsider voice, or I don't know. If you had to summarize for me, besides what I've already read in Miriam's very good article, what is the kind of main problem in Tunisia besides the economic stagnation, if you like, or the fact that the economy isn't really growing? And how would you encapsulate the corruption that you think is in Tunisia, and how would that be solved? What would be the quickest and the best way to fix it, and why isn't that being done?
It seems like the main problem that people have in this chat about Tunisia is the fact that Tunisia transitioned into a new form of politics, into democracy. I consider it a full democracy, personally, right? But the ex-leader was not held completely accountable for his previous actions. Whether you think that he didn't do as much as people claim he did or more, the point is he still needs to have a judicial process to get the truth out of the situation. If he's guilty of some things and innocent of other things, the judicial process will highlight that.
Well, no, that's obvious to me. I mean, yeah, you're 100% right to.
But
that's the case that you should point out that if people are guilty of crimes, a previous government, a previous regime, however you want to put it, no one does everything on their own. I mean,
but Sean, the key point here is if allowing immunity, diplomatic immunity, or allowing Ben Ali to go into exile without full accountability would mobilize his change and mobilize Tunisia to move forward, because there isn't an opportunity cost for him. In the case of Assad, where he will stay firm in his conviction, because
can I just put it on like an abstract level? All I would say.
So, do you think that's a compromise that you're like from a utilitarian perspective? Is that a compromise that you think is viable? My view on the Arab Spring is that we need to make compromise. I think.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can. Yeah. So my view on politics generally in the Arab Spring specifically is that I have quite a pragmatic opinion that we need to make compromise in order to get the change that we want. You cannot push people. Say, for example, you want to push someone to turn 180 degrees in their perspective. You need to change them 10 degrees at a time. Because if you completely make that person U-turn in everything he thinks and all his ideology, he's going to enter cognitive dissonance. He's going to enter a state of instability. I have quite a pragmatic perspective about how we should do things and the compromises we should make in doing them. But a lot of people find my view on this to be kind of morally like repugnant. Some people hate my opinion on this, but yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I'm agreeing with you. I was just trying to say that there has to be a balance. Compromise itself suggests balance, but the compromise itself has to have balance in that if you are not holding the people accountable that were doing all the things that made your country corrupt in the first place, then how can you solve that corruption? You can't. It doesn't make sense. Like you have to. It's very convenient for him, Ben Ali and his allies to have got everyone to frame the conversation in this way, because you're letting him off the hook, right? Like, I understand you have to create consensus, you have to bring the country together, but on the other hand, if you don't hold the people accountable who are doing all the terrible things in the first place, how are you going to progress? It just.
If I may respond to Osama,
I don't agree with you.
Yeah, I don't agree. I disagree with you 100%. Compromise is good, but not when it comes to democracy. Not when the person that you're compromising with took away your human rights. Compromise with Ben Ali was he ran away. It was a good option for him was that he got to keep his power. A bad option was for him to suffer consequences, whether that be killed, whether that be jail for life, or whatever that might look like. A compromise with you cannot compromise with a tyrant. You cannot even sit down and discuss with a tyrant because they already oppressed you. You cannot meet them halfway, because even walking 1 meter towards a tyrant or 1 meter towards an oppressor is you compromising your own values and your own human rights towards them. Therefore, compromising is good, but not when it comes with dealing with tyrants or oppressors.
Matt, can I ask you a question, Malik?
Yes.
If you think...
Sorry, Sean, can I just hear Miriam's perspective quickly?
Sorry.
Quickly. Apologies.
No, I have to agree with Malik on this one. Other than the fact that Ben Ali has literally given Tunisia nothing when you look at it from this perspective. No health, no strong health system, no strong education, extremely poor infrastructure. Other than when you read stories about what people have been through under his regime, in terms of people getting murdered, raped, tortured, imprisoned, killed. Some people don't even know where their sons or daughters have been buried. It's crazy. There is no compromise to be made here. I think people at the time were extremely happy, at least as soon as it happened, that he actually left. Like he was gone. Like Ben Ali was no longer a leader. I think people at the moment were just like, that just happened. People then started worrying about the fact that, okay, no justice was served. But I think at the moment, no one can deny the fact that Tunisians were relieved to a certain extent. Speaking of the majority, at least, Tunisians were relieved.
Well,
and let's be honest,
don't forget, France sent a cargo ship or cargo plane of basically law enforcement supplies just before Ben Ali. But obviously, Ben Ali then fled before he was able to receive it, and then he was rejected asylum in all of these places where he thought he was pally and friendly with, whether it was Paris, Tel Aviv, or Rome, and he had to go off to Riyadh in Saudi Arabia.
Can I address my question?
Because these countries kind of wanted like dictatorship to remain in Tunisia, so they were willing to keep Ben Ali. At least that's my opinion on it. That's what I think, and I think most people actually think that.
Definitely.
Sean, you had a question?
Yes. Oh, thank you, Malik. I just wanted to try and be fair to Oz's point in the sense, I think I'm not just saying this to try and please everyone. I think I can agree with both of your points. I think you can't compromise with a dictator as long as they continue to be a dictator. But I think what Oz is saying is that by sometimes compromising in the sense that, hypothetically, if you get a dictator to concede power or to agree to hold elections, for example, by having that person in your country... He did hold elections. By agreeing to
they weren't actually.
Let me ask you this. If obviously this is an extreme case, but it's good sometimes to take into extreme cases to actually see the example. If tomorrow Kim Jong-un woke up and said, we're holding elections in North Korea and I'm running for president, do you think the North Korean people would vote for someone else other than Kim Jong-un, considering for the past few decades they've been oppressed by his whole family? And B, do you think the West or anyone else in their right mind would actually believe Kim Jong-un saying that North Korea will transition into a democracy, that he had a change of heart?
I don't believe that was Oz's point. I think Oz's point was that by keeping that person in some way, even if it's just to hold them to account and to put them in trial, to involve them in the political process in that way can help bring justice. And that, as you were talking about, all these people who are buried, often the only people who know where all these people are buried, all these skeletons in the literal and figurative closet are the regime. If they all run away, they all scatter like roaches, then that can also prevent positive change, right?
But that's the problem that we're running into.
That you still have the Ben Ali cohort. You still have the Ben Ali elite.
That's the thing.
Those enablers of Ben Ali are still running the country to this day.
Yeah, I think let me just make this point real quick on the way in which the protests were even broadcast to the world was interesting, because if you take a closer look at Nessma TV being owned by Tariq Ben Ammar and Silvio Berlusconi, they were the first TV station in privately owned TV station in Tunisia who started to broadcast the process and started to kind of instigate a debate for the need for democratic change. And I think that was almost like a major fault line, because that illustrated the conflict within the ruling elite. Basically, as far as I see, and this is the interesting thing with Ben Ali.
Nessma TV is very anti-revolution. Let's be honest for a second here, okay? Nessma TV, like the wife of the person in charge of Nessma TV, Nabil Kharwi, was actually working as the Microsoft DG under.
Did Nessma TV broadcast? Were they one of the first, if not the first, to broadcast protests and start to
I
talk
don't think that their
early in
intention was. I don't think that their intention was
2010
to
in December?
broadcasting a revolution.
No,
I don't
no.
think
Here's the
their
thing.
intention
Here's
was.
the thing. Let me tell you what Ben Ali did on the 10th
Go
and
ahead.
13th of January. On the 10th of January, he went out and said that these people are attacking government buildings, state institutions, and innocent civilians, and they're criminals, talking about the people protesting his own regime. On the 13th, he agreed to negotiate and said that I'm going to give you press freedom and the internet will no longer be censored and I won't run for presidency again. But people weren't buying it. He fled like one day later. Here's the thing. People at the beginning were drawing the image that look at what people are doing. People want an unstable Tunisia. That was the intention of so many like news media. That's the idea they were trying to share.
Okay, I hear you, Mary. Malik, would you agree with that analysis that Nessma, their intention with broadcasting protests was the kind of
Nessma's framework and Ben Ali's framework was, and their whole story that they were trying to put out to the Tunisian people was that, okay, we hear you guys having a problem. Here, let's go out and compromise. We're going to have a compromise with you. And that's where the Tunisian people were like, no, we're not going to have a compromise. Let's actually finish the job and actually get rid of you. We don't want this. So yes, Nessma did report on it, but did they report on it the same framework that the people were demanding? No, they did not. And that's where the difference is.
Let's be honest. Yeah, exactly. This was with all news channels because technically Ben Ali was still in charge at the time. News channels were, most of them, if not all of them, were actually afraid of reporting.
Yeah, like
in case Ben Ali didn't actually run away, they were actually afraid of reporting. The press freedom was extremely limited. It was practically non-existent under Ben Ali's regime.
I agree. No, I agree with all of that. My point was just to highlight the fact that when Nessma TV started to broadcast these protests, what it indicated was that within the ruling elite, there was split. They weren't all reading off the same hymn book. I understand. I hear what you guys said in terms of analysis, but that was almost like the watershed moment.
Okay, I see where you're coming from. But the thing is that yes, there was a power struggle in the elite, if you want to call it that. And then the whole point was that, and that's what brings me to my point, which is that they're like, okay, let's get rid of Ben Ali, let's frame this whole framework into we're getting rid of Ben Ali and make it seem like we're changing it up and just bring up another person. It's the same way that how similar to a certain extent what happened in 89 when Bourguiba, there was a coup d'etat and Ben Ali took power. Yes, there was a change of regime, but we just switched from one dictator to another. And that's what they thought was going to happen. Yes, we're going to get rid of Ben Ali, but we're going to bring in another person who was a tyrant. And that's where the people actually took power. And they were like, no, we don't want that. But where the elite succeeded is they managed to come back to the political system and stay in power. And that was the problem.
I agree. No, I agree with that analysis wholeheartedly. I think when you look at the fact that Najib Shebi or Slim Amanu or even Rashid Ghannouchi, all that, I think we'll get to that point maybe when we start to speak about Ghannouchi.
I think speaking of Rashid Ghannouchi, we have to even if most people actually aren't for implementing Islamic.
But just quickly, Mary, I just want to make the point quickly, the point I was trying to make off the back of Malik was that yes, I agree that the way he's framed that is good analysis, and Najib Shebi and people like Salim Amanu, I think would be more evidence of what he was saying. So go ahead.
Yeah. No, but I was just moving on to the next point. Basically, if people disagree with Rashid Ghannouchi, disagree with Ennahda, disagree with their ideology, and that's completely acceptable. But I think what most people sometimes tend to forget is that Ennahda was one of them, suffered too much under Ben Ali's regime, probably more than anyone else. People, political leaders under Ennahda, if you read the stories and what they've been through, it's traumatizing. It's absolutely traumatizing. And I think most people realize that even if they disagree with Ennahda and they aren't really for implementing Islamic views, even if they're for secularism in Tunisia, they at least acknowledge that, okay, Rashid Ghannouchi, he's actually been through a lot under their regime. Ennahda has suffered quite a lot. And it's just a point I wanted to note out. Not saying I support Ennahda, but I'm just saying that you have to admit that.
That Ennahda was persecuted and was basically outlawed. I don't disagree with that. The issue is more with there was almost like a contingency plan that Kanushi made with Najib Shebi, in the sense of they were friends, and they both, at the end of the day, they're both pro-US, even if they may come from different perspectives. They're both pro-US, and when you're framing Kanushi as being some type of or Ennahda more broadly as being persecuted, you then almost kind of poison the well, so to speak, when it comes to, all right, now that when Kanushi got into power, what happened? We only have to look at the assassinations that occurred during his time in power, and when we start to link up, when we start to look at Shukri Belad and the fact that he was killed, and he was a progressive, he was killed, and there's whispers of,
here's the thing though, there hasn't really been any proof that Ennahda are responsible for these assassinations.
I know it hasn't been proved. The court case is still ongoing, but my point is that from Shukri Belad's point of view, whether it is surviving spouse or whether it's his defense team, they will clearly point towards Ennahda and the so-called the League to Protect the Revolution, or whatever the term was.
I was going to agree with Zoyab in this case, actually, in that I did know who Ennahda were. They were actually one of the few kind of political entities that I read about and heard about soon after the revolution. And one of the few things I heard about Ennahda were that they were responsible for some of these assassinations. It was all over the press that I was reading at the time. And
I'm not trying to say that. Like, all I wanted to point out was that Ennahda was basically like, just people of parts of Ennahda suffered so much under Ben Ali's regime, and they only became like they went through so much repression, and they only really became a legal political party after Ben Ali was ousted. That's all I really wanted to point out. The fact that a lot of people disagree with them, let's be honest, but you also have to acknowledge that a lot of people agree with them as well, and the fact that they got the majority of seats in the parliament the past elections are just a great indication of that.
What was the voter turnout? What was the voter turnout in the last election?
Ennahda got the majority. They got less than they did.
What was the voter turnout?
I'm pretty sure it was one of the highest voter turnouts.
What was the percent? Sorry, what was the percentage of people who came out?
I don't have a quantitative state, but I'm pretty sure it was one of the higher.
Ennahda got 52 seats out of 270.
He's asking voter turnout, not voter like how many people turned out to vote. I don't have quantitative, but I know I forgot. It was one of the higher ones. The Tunisian culture was very.
You go.
What I'm gonna comment.
I forgot the percentage was.
Sorry, just very quickly, Ziria, before you respond to this, I just want Salsabil, Sosan, and Emel to think about whether or not they believe that the suppression of Islamic institutions in Tunisia mobilized in part the export of Tunisian foreign fighters in Libya. So I want to jump to this discussion after we finish this point. So yeah. So what was your point, Ziriab, about the voter turnout for?
I mean, up until now, and I think that's what Malik was getting at when he said it's one of the highest so far. So okay, this latest election is probably one of the highest turnouts, but up until now, it's been very low turnout. I mean, in 2019 there was an election around 32% of the people who had turned up. So what it's shown is that the initial zeal that the people had due to the revolution started to peter out, given the fact that the elite entrenched themselves in power and basically. So it sounded. Yeah.
Sorry. So a quick Al Jazeera search. I'm skimming through the article. 45% in this last election, and the only time higher than that was in 2014, which was 64%. So. Whether you agree with Ennahda or not, my point is whether you agree with Ennahda's ideologies or not, you have to acknowledge as someone who, from an objective point of view, one, that Ennahda has popular beliefs, that Islamic beliefs and Islamic values are cherished and appreciated by a lot of Tunisian communities and a lot of Tunisian society. That's a fact. That is a fact. That is not an opinion. That many Tunisians actually valued Ennahda in itself. Two, Ennahda was prosecuted.
Just a second, can I just add on that point just before you move on? The thing is, people are, a lot of people are so invested into Islamic thought, and there's this new party that actually got formed for the past elections, and it was called the Dignity Coalition, and they got a decent number of seats considering it's the first time, just because they were an Islamic thinking party. So I think it just shows that a large proportion of the Tunisian population are for Islamic thought.
And yeah, I agree. Like a lot of people, I'm for separation of government and religion, but it's almost dumb. It's absurd to suggest that you should not have a party that does not take into consideration people's thoughts and people's ideas. So that was my first point. And the second point is that, like Mariam mentioned earlier, Ennahda was one of the heaviest, if not the heaviest, political party it is the heaviest political party that was prosecuted in Ben Ali's time. And its people are one of the people who were prosecuted as the most. And because of that, and going back to the assassination, I would just like to make sure that we don't get into conspiracy theories, because that is what it is. That Ennahda assassinated that person is only a conspiracy theory, and it is not proven at all. I actually have a meeting at 6, so I will have to get going. This was an amazing discussion. Thank you, Mariam, for inviting me, and I will definitely be looking out for more discussions like these. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, have a great day.
You too.
Assalamu
alaikum. So okay, Mariam, so the point that you made earlier about compromise and how we didn't compromise in Ben Ali's case, I concede that, and Sean will tell you this is very rare, I concede that you have a point that essentially it's not a form of compromise if there was no accountability at all. It would be a form of compromise if there was some accountability and there was some accountability missing. But if we go by your premise, which is that it was essentially missing, then I accept that it's not necessarily compromised, right? But what I want to understand now, yeah.
Oh, can I pose a question? Because I did want to ask them about, because they're talking about Ennahda, and I want to know what the part that this discussion kind of had in their overall argument. Why do you feel that the presence of Ennahda and their prominence in the Tunisian political process is a sign of a kind of a healthy democracy there then? Or was that your point, Miriam?
I think it does, to be honest. I think it does.
Yeah, I agree with Miriam.
It just accommodates to the whole of Tunisia. You have people who are for Islamic thought, you have people who aren't for it. It's just a balance. It just shows we have this party that represents you people and this party that represents you people.
Exactly.
And why then?
Let's be honest, a majority of people actually continue to live their ways informed by Arab and Muslim values, to be honest, in Tunisia. Yeah.
I just wondered, to also, if I could also get your opinion on why do you think they lost? Because from a quick search, it says that they lost quite a few of their seats in the last election as opposed to the previous legislative election. So
I think it really has to do with the fact that they there was something. Basically, they went into a coalition with Nida at the time when they won their election, when they won in the past elections as well, in the parliamentary elections, and they agreed on. Wait, I have to translate this because I don't know it in Arabic. In English, give me a second.
That's fine.
Can you say it in Arabic?
Basically, they approved of in the last parliamentary, basically throughout the parliament, they suggested and they approved on something called Qanun al-Musalaha al-Idariyya. It technically means for any businesses that had any corrupt, did anything wrong or in terms of corruption, and anything would be forgiven, if that makes sense.
Okay, fine.
And a lot of people thought that makes absolutely no sense considering how much corruption happened in Tunisia at the time. They thought it was quite hypocritical. And the fact that they went in with Nida and they agreed with them on a lot of things, people thought why would you do that?
People thought
it was kind of a political game.
They were the people who were so oppressed, and they had been really on the rough end of the previous regime, but then they had sold out.
To some extent, yeah. to some extent.
Do
A
you-
lot of people lost trust in them, but a lot of people decided that no, it was part of a political game and it makes sense.
Do you think, Miriam, do you think that the suppression of, so I agree with you that you cannot force democracy by suppressing Islamist or Islamic democratic parties, because that's totally counterintuitive. I mean, the equivalent from the other perspective, like in France, when they try to enforce secularism by banning the wearing of the kippah or the cross or the hijab in public sphere, that is an ideology.
Ben Ali banned to some extent wearing the hijab as well under his regime.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And
So this
certain,
completely undermines
yeah.
the whole point of secularism and democracy. I agree with you on this.
Yeah, it
That's
wouldn't
the
work.
thing,
You'll just
that's
get a
the thing,
backlash.
yeah.
You get resentment and backlash, and
Exactly.
it just doesn't work.
Here's the thing. Ben Ali was also, a lot of people spoke against Ben Ali and were imprisoned who were actually for secularism and leftists. That's the thing. A lot of people who actually spoke against him weren't actually Islamists.
Do you
Stop
think
people.
that the suppression of Islamic institutions led to radicalization in Tunisia, or the export of foreign fighters?
I'd like to jump in after.
Fine, yeah. Miriam, do you have an opinion on this before Ziriab jumps in?
I think it played a role. I think it did. Because it kind of like him forcing a secular state while disregarding like a specific train thought kind of backfired on him, because a lot of people again were for this, were for Islamic thought, for Ennahda. A lot of people agreed with their ideology and kind of backfired on him.
Sure. Ziriab?
Okay, yeah. I think the answer to your question, as far as I'm concerned, is no. I don't think it lended itself to extremism or it lended itself to radicalization at all. I think I would go as far as to say that the arrival of Ennahda, the arrival of the guide of the Brotherhood, of the Muslim Brotherhood in Tunisia, Rashid al-Nushi, he came back in spectacular fashion, much like Khomeini did from France when he arrived back from France and he ran to all the fanfare and became top guy there. Al-Nushi came about in a similar fashion in terms of the fanfare, and then obviously went through elections and whatnot. But the point is that this is why the whole point of persecution and whatnot, the reason why Al-Nushi was imprisoned numerous times in Tunisia before he found asylum in the UK was because he attempted coup d'etat. Because the organization around Al-Nushi tried to do a coup d'etat in '87. He first went off to Sudan where he got exiled, and the guide of the revolution there, Hassan al-Turabi, who was in Turkey, who was in Sudan, gave him asylum. Then he went off to Turkey. Then he went over to in Turkey. Obviously, Erdogan was probably the mayor of Istanbul at that point. And then in '93, he entered Londonistan. Do you know what I mean? So that's he entered Londonistan, and he was chilling there until he was able to go back to Tunisia. So the issue is when you're framing him as some type of persecuted. No, the reason why he was in prison is because they tried a coup, and if you try the same thing in this country, if you try that in any country, you are going to get the long arm of the law knocking on the door. That's the long and short. But you can't make him out to be some type of martyr if he's going against the setup there. In any case, what I would argue is that the arrival of Ennahda emboldened extremists. It emboldened the Islamists, and we see that emboldening in the fact that assassinations occurred up and down the country. Now, what I was arguing for is that the League for the Protection of the Revolution, that's the term, and this is the equivalent of the secret wing or the secret branch that's within the Muslim Brotherhood. It's well attested to. There's a number of literature, numerous literature you can look up in terms of a study of the Muslim Brotherhood, how it was organized, and the secret branch, which was tasked with, as the name suggests, secret operations, military operations, as opposed to the political operation. So I would argue that the arrival of Ennahda emboldened Islamists, and we're seeing right now, we see the fact that the Syrians, as you said, Syrians arriving through Tunisia into Libya, I don't think that would have occurred in any other situation.
So the arrival of Tunisian forces, Tunisian fighters in Libya, okay, so your position is that Ennahda's presence in Tunisia emboldened these fighters. There are some people that believe that Tunisian fighters in Libya were actually political fighters, but they were framed as ISIS fighters. So do you think that their ideology or their identity or connection with Libya is one of a pan-Islamic ideology, or is it like a North African kind of political, and we need to help our neighbors, this kind of thing?
Right, interesting. That's a good question. I think I would go to the former. I think it's more to do with the ideology of pan-Islamism, the Salafist ideology, or the Islamist Salafist ideology of,
Pan-Islamism. Okay, what do the other people in the conversation say?
I just was going to ask so then if he's kind of trying to dispute Miriam's earlier contention that the prominence of Ennahda as a sign of a healthy democracy in Tunisia. He's saying that they embolden the more radical Islamist forces within the country. So are you trying to dispute that point?
Say that again, I don't think I heard it. What'd you say?
Miriam said earlier that the prominence of Ennahda in Tunisia was a sign of a kind of a healthy democracy there. I'm wondering if you're trying to dispute that point, maybe indirectly, by saying that actually the success of Ennahda was what emboldened the kind of radical Islamists. Obviously, that's not a very good thing to have, and that's not very healthy. So are you just trying to add some nuance to the conversation, or are you saying that the Ennahda's success is a net negative overall? Or I'm just wondering what your overall view is on that.
Right, in terms of value, I wouldn't make a value judgment or value. Yeah, I wouldn't make a value judgment on it. I'm simply illustrating how the arrival of Ennahda was followed up with a spate of assassinations that targeted dissidents. So it's very interesting, isn't it, that the so-called people who were persecuted become prominent in power and then go on to persecute others. So, I mean, obviously it's not been proven in a court of law yet, but the fact that Ennahda was in political power whilst these assassinations were ongoing is what makes me make the statement that, the arrival of Ennahda emboldened the Islamists in the country.
My main question when it comes to any kind of a religious political party is always, when trying to suss them out, is their commitment to democracy genuine, or do they see it as only a tool to kind of gain greater religious power to the point where they can eventually discard it? If you see what I mean, like, do you believe that Ennahda, how committed to democratic values do you think they really are?
Can I come in on this point?
Yeah.
So if you look at Said Qutb's work in Egypt, I believe it was Milestones where he mentioned this.
I know.
He essentially, it's essentially an Islamist text that talks about, the role of like Islamic political institutions in Arab governance. He makes the claim that you can use democracy as a means to an end of implementing his undemocratic take of Sharia law in the system, and then discard of democracy once you've done that, right? Now, I think Ziryab is making a really good point, because if we're going to say that, it was my opinion in this chat earlier, that you cannot suppress Islamist ideology because it becomes undemocratic. But then Islamist ideology could in turn undermine democracy. So by not suppressing them, you're potentially empowering it. So it's kind of a vicious circle, right?
Yeah, 100%. I would assume that's the argument that the reactionaries would make. But that's the problem, isn't it? It can be used by reactionaries like them.
Yes, exactly. And a lot of the North African regimes, for example, Ben Ali, Gaddafi, and Bouteflika in Algeria, they all justified their rule. In part of their rhetoric was the fact that they're cracking down on terrorism. That's what they use to justify their leadership during that period. So it's a really kind of it's a very complicated dynamic between the Islamist discourse, the extent to which you allow it and suppress it, and how that undermines or propels democratic institutions. It's a very
tricky one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because you're saying, basically that it's a no-win situation if you frame it that way, because you either repress these religious forces and that kind of fuels their narrative and their almost messianic thinking, and it empowers them further, or you allow them to participate in the democratic process. And again, if they have that popular support, they only get stronger and stronger. And it makes you wonder if, I would just be inclined to say let them. If there is a genuinely healthy and strong kind of secular opposition that is strong enough to keep them in check, but is not strong enough to hold power, then you might just have to accept that in a real democracy, that the country is just socially conservative. It was the norm across Europe and across democracies for, I don't know, probably most of the history of quote unquote democracy in Europe anyway, that our societies were quite conservative. There are all sorts of laws and policies in place that represented a kind of religious conservatism. So why are
you talking about when you say?
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, why was Europe allowed to go through that process and be allowed to be kind of have that social conservatism, that religious conservatism, and not have its leaders say, actually, I'm going to crush any semblance of democracy in the name of crushing terrorism? It just seems very transparent to me.
Okay, I see what you mean.
And then they even went through rebranding. It was at one point the movement of Islamic nationality, and then it was renamed the Renaissance Society movement, and Ennahda, very, very nice sounding. You know what I mean? So there's PR behind it, and the point is to allay fears that North Africans have of the Muslim Brotherhood. The reality is that it's not Islamism that's a problem per se. It's violent Islamism. It's a specific strain of Islamism.
The thing is, Ennahda was never actually like. No, but that's not really the case with Ennahda. Again, nothing's been proven. A lot of people have actually argued that this was an attempt to actually tarnish the Ennahda party during this time with the assassinations. But honestly, I'm not.
What about the facilitation of Tunisian fighters in Syria in 2011 or 2012, I should say, when he was in power?
Again, a lot of the same way a lot of Tunisians are arguing that Ennahda is behind this, a lot of people are arguing that Ennahda actually isn't behind this. Technically, there is this path and that happen.
What we're talking about is responsibility. If Ennahda is in power in 2012 and there's many thousands of Tunisians are going into Syria to fight, then
the president at that time wasn't actually part of Ennahda. Just to point that out.
Yeah. Okay. The other thing I wanted to point out was this dichotomy, or I feel is a false dichotomy between a secular kind of challenging or a secular opposition and an Islamist party. The reality is that, and I think this is what Mariam is getting at, the reality is that Rashid al-Ghannouchi was working very, very closely with extreme left-wing people like Monsef Marzouki. He was president of the Arab Committee for Human Rights, and he also kind of was the balancing act between himself and Marzouki. They were able to kind of do like
but Ennahda, which was actually a secular party, actually came together with Ennahda at some point as well. Here's the thing: I think people are just acknowledging, at least in Tunisia, that you have to work together despite all differences, because that's just the reality in Tunisia. That's just the reality.
What do they have in common? My point in raising this, because I'm well aware of that reality. My point is, what is it that unites all of them? What do they all agree on? And I don't want to be too reductive, but one thing that they all agree on is a pro-US stance, for example.
Wait, come again? You're saying that the very left-wing people that Ennahda or Ghannouchi was allied with, that they were pro-US?
They are. Marzouki and his clan are pro-US, yeah. And so is Najib Shebi. He was at one point, he was a Maoist, then he became a Trotskyist, then he became a pawn for the American interest.
So kind of like the YPG or something, like the Kurds. Are you sure that wasn't
the YPG.
Yeah. Are you sure that wasn't like a strategic pro-US thing, kind of like in the case with the kind of certain Kurdish forces? I don't know.
It could be, because if you look at, so there's a Jewish guy, Simon Salama, and I think he wasn't he made leader of Ennahda party at one point? And I think that was to do with kind of branding or what's it called? What's the word? Legitimizing their party. But it's very interesting that we have to be pro-US to legitimize a party. I think it's possible to have an Arab democratic, like an Arab take on a democratic or democratic Muslim party.
It can be about branding, but it could also just be geopolitics, Oz, in the sense that with the Kurds, because that's kind of the closest analogy that I have some knowledge of here, they seem to think, I believe, obviously you can't go into their minds, but that the US is probably the only force that can keep their more immediate enemy or barrier in check, which is kind of the Syrian government and the Turks, perhaps. I mean, the US are nominally Turkish allies, but they also have, in theory, the ability to hold them in check. And obviously Trump didn't do that, but they miscalculated that one. But yes, and if you to go back to your earlier point, Zoria, about them being allied, I think the common thread there is not necessarily that they are allied for to the US for strategic reasons either. I think in any dictatorship that people have been living under for decades, you see a similar thing in maybe to a lesser extent, but in Israel with the Joint List, right? Like the Arab political forces within Israel formed that kind of umbrella, that coalition, because they realize that they have a bigger enemy, like they have some deeply dictatorial or authoritarian forces that are arrayed against them. And you have to put aside some of these other ideological differences sometimes to build that coalition that can undo the same barriers that you're all facing. So it can be strategic in that sense too, but it's just me spitballing. But yeah.
My point was more in regards to the fact you have remnants of the Ben Ali regime still within the corridors of power, and the so-called new guard which came in were not too far removed from the same interest that the Ben Ali regime represented. Because as I said at the outset, the Ben Ali regime was imposed upon Tunisia, or kind of, I say imposed with the support. Ben Ali came into power with the support of the US, France, Israel, and the usual suspects. That's the reality. And they're the ones who allowed him and turned a blind eye to him robbing the country blind for some 20 odd years. Now, it's those same people who then framed, those same countries, I should say, those same interests who framed the issue as being one of just national corruption and so on and so forth, and reform, as opposed to real political reform. So my point is more towards the fact that you do have an overlap between so-called Islamists and so-called left-wingers or secular parties in Tunisia. And so the dichotomy of, if you've got an Islamist party in power, as long as there's a good, secular opposition, that's checks and balances, and you can have a vibrant democracy. I'd say no, they can be bedfellows. And
I see what you mean. You're saying the mere fact that
they're bedfellows. Let me finish the point.
Sorry,
they're bedfellows for the purpose or for the what underlying point. And that underlying point is pro-US kind of orientation. The fact is, when you're looking at people like Anoushi, you can still look this up right now. He gave a speech in 2013 at the Brookings Institute, and the head of the institute, Martin Indyk, was a former US ambassador to Israel and a leader of the Zionist movement. So what I'm saying is that so-called these dichotomies of Islamism being against Israel, for example, it doesn't hold water when you take a closer look at, for example, Tunisia and some of the parties in play here.
So your point is an interesting one. You're basically saying that the mere fact that opposition is quote unquote secular doesn't necessarily make them an opposition. That they could still be really in bed with these Islamist forces. But I guess then we're being quite abstract. I mean, I would put the question back to Miriam or someone who has maybe a more specific knowledge here. I mean, we just need them to agree. Do they think that Ennahda do they believe in democracy, or do they just see it as a vehicle to a kind of Islamic state? And to what extent is the secular opposition really secular and really in opposition? I mean, these aren't necessarily unanswerable questions. Right, Osama, do you want to put that to them? Or?
Yeah, I guess, my take on this is kind of like, there's a really intimate relationship, I think, between Arab secular leaders like Gaddafi, Bouteflika and Bin Ali, and Islamist parties, because they both reinforce and undermine each other. Like, what I'm trying to say is that the suppression of Islamist parties justified a lot of these people's reigns. So Bouteflika and Bin Ali would often consolidate praise by the fact that they're countering terrorism and they're working with Europe to do that. And also they're suppressing Islamist parties which have the potential to radicalize, right? But at the same time, that suppression simultaneously undermines their institutions, because it becomes a boiling pot where you just brush everything under the carpet until all the bugs like develop and start to infect the home, right? So the relationship between
nice analogy.
in Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria with Islamist parties is kind of like, you can't live with them, you can't live without them. It's a very, very strange relationship.
Well, no, that's a very good point, that they're in a sort of toxic symbiosis where they justify, no, it's a symbiosis, they justify each other, because these dictators say that they're necessary to prevent terrorism, but these terrorists say, look at these Western supported dictators.
They justify and they undermine each other simultaneously. Because suppression,
but then the way to respond to that is to allow that that you undermine both of them, both positions at the same time. You're saying to the more extreme Islamists that say there can be no real engagement with or through democratic processes by allowing them into the democratic process, and you show that engagement with them is possible to one would-be dictators, right? So I think you need to let these people participate and maybe not try and read into their intentions too much.
Yeah, exactly. I think perhaps the way we reconcile this is probably the participation of all parties, because you can't single out Islamist parties, right? What about white nationalist parties or pro-European parties or whatever, right? Or pro-imperial parties? You allow the participation of all of them in Arab politics, but with certain checks and balances. So perhaps the constitution should, instead of what I feel like Arab countries have constitutions which are kind of all or nothing. It's kind of like, we allow this or we don't allow this. Or it's superficial. What they claim to allow is just in name. If they say it's a parliamentary democracy,
I think you're about to open a very big can of worms here. I mean, this philosophical problem goes back to like the birth of democracies. Like, basically, should democracies be allowed to self-destruct? Like, to what extent can you tolerate intolerance? I mean, you have so many case studies. I mean, most famous ones are like Hitler, right? Like, he was democratically elected to an extent, and he took the reins of power. And if you democratically vote for a dictator, I mean, that's totally theoretically possible and often very practically possible. We've seen it happen.
Exactly, I agree. And some people try to close this gap, this loop, by saying that what you do is you don't tolerate intolerance, right? But this isn't actually an easy solution. And let me
because you're violating your own principles. You're throwing your own principles out the window, right? Like,
exactly. So, for example, let's say when Majid Nawaz debates Anjem Chowdhury on Newsnight or whatever, and he rationalizes it by, we allow democracy, we tolerate people that tolerate us, but when it comes to an Islamist that doesn't tolerate us, then we don't tolerate them, right? But that is a form of intolerance from his part, in so far as he only tolerates people that recognize the democratic institution. So that's not a very simple solution.
Yeah.
It's not,
but it's internally coherent, isn't it?
It's internally incoherent, exactly. It's very, very complicated.
But I think the way that people traditionally try to solve this problem is by the institution of specific laws that say things like, hate speech and incitement to violence aren't allowed, because then you're not prohibiting certain political viewpoints. I mean, I had this debate in my uni days. We had our student society put up this topic, I think, but, we were basically debating the parameters of kind of hate speech and incitement and so on. Like, if a political viewpoint, can you define a certain political viewpoint as being inherently incitement to violence, like neo-Nazism, for example? You could argue that it's inherent to certain forms of Nazism, or just Nazism full stop, that the eradication of ethnic minorities, right? Like, that's a clear incitement to violence, and therefore any political party that tries to practice that openly is therefore violating. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's probably
the national. Yeah, it's going to be controversial, or shouldn't be, but yeah, National Socialism was born out of a reaction to communism. It replaced the worker struggle, or that kind of class struggle in communism with Aryans versus Jews. That's the only thing it did.
Well, the Untermensch, like the underclass, they said that they had this very complex kind of mythology in terms of that they believe that
Yeah, that's when you get into the point, and this is personal. But I'm saying in terms of ideology, National Socialism, when you're saying it incites violence, that opens up the door to saying, okay, so but this is the point, Sean. You wouldn't accept that communism is incitement to violence, even though they're talking about a world revolution.
No, but the thing is, right?
I think revolution and whatnot.
You could argue about to what extent the National Socialists were a genuine reaction to communism, and to what extent they kind of use that as a rhetorical device. Because you see the same in kind of a nationalist, populist movement.
I was just reading Zizek. Zizek says the same thing. He admits that the National Socialism arose as a reaction to the communist class struggle.
But they hide that.
This is his point, and that they replaced that class struggle with one of Aryan versus Jews struggle. Yeah, and he just makes a point about, well, it could also be something else. But the point is, what I'm saying is, reductively, the point is that if you're going to say that National Socialism is inherently incitement to violence, then you would have to be consistent and say that communism is incitement to violence, given their ideas about world revolution.
Not necessarily, because it depends on your ideological framework, your like worldview. And that I'm saying that the socialists, the National Socialists, as they call themselves, it's in the name. I mean, they said they were opposed to communism, but what they actually tried to do, as fascists very cleverly do often, is take these opposing political viewpoints. They took the best parts of capitalist theory as they saw it. They took the best parts of socialist theory. I mean, the Nazis constructed a very, shall we say, advanced welfare state, but at the same time had these crazy social policies. And the socialists would argue that their view on class struggle is based on that this idea of there being classes really in the world. While race is essentially a BS construct, class is a real thing. That's the first thing. Secondly, they would argue that the way that they're defining the upper classes in this class framework are as inherently criminal groups, not because of the mere virtue of what ethnic group they're born into, but by the behaviors that you demonstrate by being a part of a certain class. You are doing something criminal. So they're saying we're defining people by their selfish economic behaviors, not by some trait that they cannot possibly control.
Okay, but if race is a BS construct and class is a real thing, how can people tolerate classism? But how come you, Sean, would tolerate classism and not racism?
What? So
you wouldn't tolerate racism at all, right? You said it's a BS construct, but
it's fundamentally, like, scientifically,
yeah. But you would tolerate classism. You wouldn't think it's like a crime.
No, I just think if someone, I don't want to go too off topic here, but if, let's say you had a village in the middle of nowhere, right, where this guy controls the well that everyone drinks from, and he suddenly says one day, I'm going to charge you all like so much money, you won't be able to have dinner every day just so that you can drink from this well. Like, that's a capitalist taking control of something that's really in the public interest and should belong to the collective, and trying to make a profit off of it. Like, you know, that's famous Marxist quote that the last capitalist will be hung by his own rope he tried to sell you. You know, I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but like, I'll try not to be prejudiced, but if people are saying that there's something that is mine by right, like that I have a right to my own land, to the river that's next to my house, to my own crops, to my own energy infrastructure, there are certain things that rightly belong to the public, and some guy tells me actually it's not mine, then he's committing a crime against me. He's denying me my birthright.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Fine. Okay, so back to the point about Tunisia and Libya. Sulsan and Ahmed believe that Islamist movements have misguided the youth. And that actually, I think this is one of my arguments for separating Islamic rule and politics, because I think that as humans, we're all very fallible. We're all subject to our own biases, our own interpretation. And if we're going to represent the Quran and we're going to represent Islamic rule in the country, we need to be very, 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 very careful about how we do that. And only step forward when we really believe that we have the knowledge to represent it with the respect that it deserves to be represented, right? So would you agree that it's reckless for these Islamist parties to conflate their subjective opinion on Islam with an objective one, and to misguide the youth and bring this region into instability? What's your view on this?
I agree with you, of course, because there is kind of this this misunderstanding of the religion itself. Like, it should be like separated. So as a secular, as long as the as long there is a clear and a precise description and how just, because if an Islamist is ruling the country and then he's obviously doing some corruption, obviously that kind of undermines the whole point of Islam, the religion itself. So I don't know at what point that's reliable to have like an Islamist in an Islamic state. So
yeah, I think it's dangerous. Sorry.
You think it's what,
No.
Emma?
I was just going to say, I think it's dangerous sometimes to mix religion with politics. Like, obviously, religion is an important part of your identity and it will play a part. But when you have, like, whole parties completely centered around religion, I think it's really dangerous because, like, you'll find that people are willing to die for religion.
Yeah,
and when
exactly.
Islam says this and someone else completely fundamentally agrees.
And I think
you might be in a different way, like politically or something, but then it becomes like almost like a war, like immediately, because religion is like a sensitive topic that people will literally die for. So I don't know, sometimes it should be distanced from politics slightly.
And I think this kind of touches a lot on millennials and like our parents, like generation before, not like millennials now or generation Z, like us, but like more old people. So they have this idea, this concept that if Islam is ruling and an Islamic party is ruling, that this means that it's healthy, it's good. So they don't have like a mean of, I don't know if
yeah, it can infringe on people's rights as well. Like I don't know, I believe it's wrong, like you know, when governments force people like, oh, you have to wear a hijab and stuff, I think it takes away from wearing a hijab as well, because it's not even a choice. It's like the government has like forced you to in some countries. And I think
I agree with that.
more meaning when you choosing yourself.
Also, sorry, just to add to your point, just like a really small point, I totally agree with what Ahmed is saying. Also, from an Islamic perspective, they're not doing it because they have the inner belief. They're doing it because they're forced to do it, which of course doesn't really count. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Exactly. And when you take the ayah, the ayah, it's not hadith, it's in the Quran. La ikraha fi din. There's no compulsion in religion. I mean, you can argue. People argue that our views contradicts Islam, but you could argue the precise opposite. You know, there are things in the Quran that validate what we're saying, which is that, you know, lakum dinukum waliya din, la ikraha fi din, la hukma illa billah. Judgment is reserved but for God. You could state that when you want to refrain from stoning someone for something or whatever. So I don't think our views are incompatible with Islamic opinion. And the thing is, a lot of people say to me, well, you're just influenced by the West. You have a colonial mentality. That's why you view democracy sympathetically. Now, admittedly, it's true. I am a product of my environment. I'm born in the West and I am influenced by the West. But what I've realized is that this opinion isn't actually it's not actually a Western Muslim opinion. There are many, for example, if you go back to the Umayyad Caliphate and you look at the Islamic culture at that time, there were a lot of people that believed that Islam was a personal domain. It was part of the personal spiritual domain. I mean, even if you look at Ghazali and his works, he believes that Islam is a spiritual thing and politics and legislation is another thing. So this isn't a uniquely Western conversation. I think this is it's an arguably North African conversation, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it will push young people away from Islam as well, because it's literally like, you have to do this, and it shouldn't be that. It should be you choose it yourself, and I think that gives it more like weight behind it when you've chosen something yourself. Exactly.
And subhanAllah, if you look at Al-Razi in Iran, he was similar to Ghazali. A lot of the Persian polymaths believes that they believed in the line between jurisdiction and spirituality. And then you look at Iran today, and like you said, when you're imposing hijab, what's the point? What is the point in imposing a religious garment when an individual doesn't believe it? That's hypocrisy. And what does Islam say? What does Islam say about hypocrisy? So I simply don't buy the argument that people pose to me when they say that people of our kind of mindset where we're essentially, I wouldn't say we're secular in the sense that in the Western connotation of the word, I would say that we're very, very careful before, we want to be very careful before somebody comes and represents Islam in government, right? But I don't think that, I really don't see how that contradicts our religion. I don't see it.
Oz, I think, one second. Yeah, sorry, there was someone else.
The thing is, I think Islam is compatible with democracy. It's just that the people have a misinterpretation of Islam and its values. That's the problem. That's the thing you guys highlighted. That's the main issue with people. There's just so much misinterpretation when it comes to Islam, in my opinion.
But Anushi has the right interpretation of Islam and democracy.
The thing is, like with Ghanouchi, I think he mentioned in some sort of interview in the past couple of years that he's, at least with Ennahda, this is what he stated. I'm not adding anything from my own words, but he stated that he thinks democracy and Islam are compatible, and Islam and human rights are compatible, and he's against any use of violence in politics, so he's really against any form of extremism. These are his own words, honestly.
But yeah, you're right. He talks a really good game. He does talk a really good game. But the question is there a gulf between rhetoric and reality? That's the question.
Yes, exactly. Sorry, very quickly, just to echo what Ziriab said, Mariam. Even I view Ghanouchi quite sympathetically as well. I kind of like these philosopher type Muslims. I always have, right? But do you acknowledge that his? I'm
not the biggest fan of him. I'll tell you that much. I'm definitely not the biggest fan of him.
Okay, I don't want to misrepresent you. So you're not the biggest fan of him. You agree with some points of his, but do you accept that he also is subjectively interpreting the religion? You do? Do you accept that? Yeah. Like he has his own
feel like
interpretation.
most, let's be honest, Islamic parties all over the world to some extent do. Yeah.
Oz, can I just say something quickly though? Because I just want to make sure that you're not trying to define religion itself or any religious participation in politics as subjective. I mean, it doesn't have to be in that you could have a objective form of religion, but even trying to find that objective form of religion can be an ongoing process, particularly in terms of how you apply it in government. And if you look at the precedent, Islamically speaking, there was, I think, a clear precedent at the time of the Prophet and prophets that they had to live peacefully with members of other religious communities, and they had certain laws or religious edicts that they put in place for their own, that were aimed at their own community. But then you also have a body of laws and policies that you practice with regard to other religious communities, or a set of common laws that you all follow so that you can all coexist, like as you had in the Constitution of Medina. I think the main difference between now and in most of history is that we live in a very interesting time, a globalized era, and in a time of so-called tolerance. I mean, I think we do have some tolerance, but it could be more tolerant, where you have these people of different religious inclinations, different sects, and just different religions living very closely with each other, which I don't think you saw that much in history, right? Like people generally one religion were in one country and people of another religion were in another country. So you have to have that body of laws that you could call it common law, you could call it democratic law, you can call it whatever you want, but a body of laws that all people can agree on and build, a body of laws that people can build together, but across different religious communities. And then even within the Muslim community, I mean, why should we rule as strong men either? Do the scholars have to, why can't they create that kind of Islamic consensus in that kind of deliberate way of thought?
Basically, I don't. When I was Ziriab, you may not know this, but I used to work in Quilliam a while ago, right? And when I was there, I did have the view that religion was subjective. I don't have this view now. I think I have quite a Platonic view of religion. I think there is an objective religion, and there is an objective truth out there.
You're a Hellenist. You're Greek.
Yeah, exactly, right? But I think that we do our best to try to understand it. And I think we cannot escape our own subjective view and outlook of religion. This is what I think. So when we receive religion and when we try to implement it into politics or daily life or whatever, it becomes subjective. This is my opinion.
But it's not subjective if it's a deliberative objectivity by definition means that which is kind of shared or a common viewpoint, right? Like if you build that common view, like politics just means taking a view might be held collectively, but if you're trying to enact that collectively held opinion in some kind of law or policy, then it could be seen as objective religion and politics, but to find that consensus, you have to have a consensual process.
Well, it's not even consensus isn't a good argument, because it's an appeal to majority. Because, for example, if you talk to Shia and you say to them, well, how can you be right if there's so many Muslimin, Sunni and whatever, they will just say, well, that's just a majority thing. Like, you can't, just because you're, and actually the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ says the same thing himself in one of the hadiths when he talks about there being, what is it, 70 versions of religion and only one true one near the end of time or something. So actually that's him saying that the truth is in the minority. So the majority argument doesn't really hold.
Okay, but the minority could, okay, that's all.
I think, okay.
With the personage of President Marzouki, yeah, it's interesting that President Marzouki was someone who was subject to some controversy as to the origin, whether he was even qualified to become president. Meaning, according to the constitution, of course, you had to be a Tunisian citizen or whatnot, which is not problematic. But it turns out, and there was a bit of controversy around this. As I say, Tunisia Secret published an excerpt from President Marzouki's birth certificate, where it's marked, quote, by the rectification judgment emanating from the trial court of Grombalia on December 2011, number 80180, the present certificate has been modified as follows. The mother's nationality is indeed Tunisian, end quote. So what I'm saying is, according to Tunisia Secret, the president's mother was a Moroccan national her whole life, which would bar him from holding the highest office in the land. And this is in accordance with Article 40 of the 2009 Constitution. So if that's the case, I'd like to put that to any Tunisians on the panel. What do you think? What do you make of that controversy surrounding Marzouki's birth certificate? We all know about like the Obama thing, which was obviously nonsense. Is this nonsense as well? Or what?
Miriam or Sosan, do you want to comment on this about Marzouki and his birth certificate, Moroccan mother? Does that make him Tunisian and so forth?
I have to be honest. I actually haven't heard of that point. I'm just gonna look through it. I actually haven't heard of it, so I really can't add anything to that.
Sosan?
I think I agree with Mariam. I don't have like any knowledge about this, so I'll definitely do a bit of research on.
What about the general point of the constitution stating that the mother, what did he say, Ziriab? The mother needs to be Tunisian?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, do you think do you think you're only Tunisian if your mother's Tunisian?
I don't think so. Like, if you're born in he's born in Tunisia, right? Yeah.
I'm looking.
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
So apparently the constitution in Tunisia states that the ruler can only be considered a Tunisian ruler if the mother is Tunisian or something like that.
Well, it's one of the conditions that your mother has to be. It's not the only condition.
As far as I know, that was in the 2009 constitution. That was before it was modified, as far as I know. I could be wrong.
That would be interesting if it was modified.
Let me check. I'll share my screen. Let's check this. 1 second.
That would be a very interesting point, though. Well done, sir.
We'll check this. So, Tunisia, mother, nationality, constitution, modified. Let's find
First off, whilst we're on that page, where was he born?
He was born
in Tunisia.
Tunisia,
yeah. He was born in Tunisia.
Grombalia?
He was born in Grombalia, yeah.
He was in Grombalia, yeah.
This makes him Tunisian. So I don't think that it matters.
25,000 people.
That's quite a Jewish take on nationality, isn't it, Sean? The mother needs to be.
You had to bring that in somehow, didn't you? No, man. It's I had no idea about it.
Wait, I thought race was a construct.
Yeah, it is. But that's to do with tribe, isn't it? Like, that's something else, man. I'm not going into that, but that's to do with tribe. Just like in terms of well, I don't know about that many other tribes in terms of their laws, but
right.
Yeah.
So the Tunisian nationality law governs the acquisition, transmission, and loss of Tunisian nationality. The law was first promulgated by decree of the Bey of Tunis, 1956. So presumably this was during the colonial era. This is a colonial era rule.
Yeah.
So The last amendment was in 2002. Hang on. From 2014, the deprivation of nationality is prohibited. And this is in accordance. Okay, so that's Wikipedia is just contradicting itself. It was amended in 2014. The deprivation of nationality is prohibited. And this is in accordance with Article 25 of the Constitution of Tunisia, adopted after the Tunisian Revolution. It is forbidden to deprive any Tunisian citizen of his nationality, to exile him, to extradite him, or to prevent him from returning to his country. So presumably, according to the amendment after 2014, if Marzouki has a Tunisian passport, then nobody can make that claim about his mother and try to revoke his nationality.
And the fact that he was born in Tunisia and his father is Tunisian, he's automatically identified as Tunisian.
Exactly. Well, I have this opinion, but
I do wonder if this controversy was behind the attempt at a no confidence vote, because I just looked it up and it says Tunisia. This is back in 2013. Tunisia's National Constituent Assembly will next week debate a no confidence motion against President Monsef Marzouki.
Interesting. Okay, we'll look at this next. So I just want to mention that I noticed this transmission of nationality by the mother. So the amendment of 1993, amending the Code of Personal Status, gives the woman the right to transmit her surname. You know what? That's actually quite feminist. That's really feminist. Her surname and her nationality to her children in the same way as her husband, even if she is married to a foreigner. So this is clearly, I mean, I know a lot of Islamists that would disagree with this, right? But this is quite a feminist ruling. And I see this as a foreign policy legislation, because there are a lot of Tunisian women that are married outside Tunisia, like in the Gulf or Egypt or whatever. So perhaps this is a way to, I don't know, maybe this is a foreign policy thing. Maybe it's about Tunisian power abroad. It could be, you know. And you, Ziryab, you mentioned the no confidence motion in Marzouki.
Yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's Tunisian Assembly. Morocco World News is the website. It's a Tunisia Assembly to debate Marzouki no confidence vote, and it says the motion, which was signed by 77 MPs, would require the backing of 109 out of the 217 lawmakers to pass, which is unlikely given the support Marzouki enjoys within the coalition government led by the ruling Islamist party Ennahda.
And do you think this is linked to his nationality?
Since late I don't think it linked up. No, as I said, I was just looking at the article before I clicked on it, and upon click through it, it does not to do with the nationality per se. But Marzouki's got if you find his biography page, his official biography page, Marzouki biography, you'll see that he was in Morocco and so on and so forth. I don't know if obviously the actual claim wasn't borne out, and he wasn't disqualified, because we would have heard that he would have been removed, but he wasn't disqualified. But I only rose it as a point of controversy.
This is perhaps why they mention it in Morocco. But you know what's interesting here? Part of the no motion motivation was the fact that after comments he made to Al Jazeera that secular extremists could spark a bloody revolution in which they would be hanged. So that's quite interesting. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier, like we need to be careful not to have, especially for example, in the case of Tunisia now, we need to be careful about when we apply limitations to intolerance if we have a bias that is very focused on Islamists, because there could be secular extremists that might be intolerant themselves, you know? So yeah.
Well, look at Sisi, isn't it? Yeah.
Exactly. Just on that point, it's a bit of a dissection. It's a bit of a divergence. Really quickly, what do people in this chat feel about Sisi making agreements with Israel and kind of making friends with them? How do you view that?
We made agreements with all sorts of people, not just Israel.
I think making deals and treating them as if they're a real state is supporting them. I'm a real believer in what's that quote? So it's basically, if you're silent in the presence of injustice, then you might as well be supporting that injustice. And I think the fact that, I think we discussed this, and as you guys know, I'm not a fan of Israel. I don't count it as a real state. It is Palestine. So making deals with them means that you're legitimizing them, which I don't think Arab countries should support.
Sure.
Can I just can I clarification on that point, Sasbel? When you say it is Palestine, do you mean that you support a one-state solution? Then were you a part of that discussion we had a few? I think it was our first conversation, was it us, or our second one, when we talked about whether people supported a two-state or? So are you saying that you only support a secular one-state solution then, or?
Yeah, I definitely support a one-state solution. Probably because a two-state one would not bring justice at all to the Palestinians. I'm not saying kick out the Israelis, because obviously that's unfair for people who don't have anything to do with it. But I think we should legitimize it as Palestine rather than Israel.
Okay, but then I agree. I mean, we shouldn't deal with any. I wouldn't single out Israel in the sense that I would say any state that is built on injustice or as a dictatorship. I mean, we look at the UK. I mean, this is quite personal to me in the sense that I'm thoroughly ashamed of my government's role as being, I think, now the second largest arms exporter in the world. And a lot of the governments that we export weapons to are on our own kind of blacklist, if you like, countries that we would label as human rights violators, places like Saudi, for example, and why is their legitimacy any greater than that? A country that has a massive amount of opposition as a dictatorship, we shouldn't really be having cozy relationships with any of them, right? Like, I would think over what Saudi has done in Yemen, that no civilized person would be dealing with them either. So if you're dealing with them for kind of a strategic purposes, I don't know.